Ebrahim, thank you so much for joining us. Several ministers, including the Trade and Industry Minister and of course the Finance Minister, have sent signals to the investor community about the fact that South Africa is stable. And this of course comes amid these ongoing wildcat strikes at several mines. Are we being unnecessarily alarmist here?
I think we're not being unnecessarily alarmist, but I think we may be being alarmist to great an extent. There's cause for concern, obviously, but we've had cause for concern since the time of our transition. Our inequality problems, our poverty problems, our disparities and differentials in wages and salaries, these are not new. That you have an individual who is exploiting the situation on his ground for his own personal survival and as a vendetta and as a punishment for who he perceives to have kicked him out of the African National Congress, I think is going to be risky for the short term, but certainly not in the long term. I mean, society has always come across these crises. It's always managed to overcome these crises. We've got a stable leadership, and I think investors ought to be taking their cues from the people who actually exercise power. Because political risk, Karema, to be frank and to be honest, is often coming from places where there are minor regulatory changes or minor policy changes. They don't always come from the big hyped events. Those happen in the short term. And let me tell you why. Even though some miners may in fact agree with Julius Malema that they need to go out on strike, miners know, and we've got evidence to suggest, to say, miners cannot go on protracted, unprotected strikes simply because they don't get paid for those days. So when the creditors come calling, miners are going to say, hell, I've got to go to work.
So are you suggesting, Ebrahim, that there is a time limit on how long strikers can actually stay out? So are we going to see people returning to work because they're actually going to feel it in their pockets, in their paychecks?
Karema, there are two risks. The one is in the short term, the risk is that you're going to have miners coming out because they're caught up in the rhetoric, they're caught up in the strike. Over time, you will also find, also in the short term, that miners will precipitate conflicts among themselves. Because it so happens that you and I are both miners, we're both on strike. But this month my creditor calls, yours doesn't, you're okay. The next month, I know I better hell go to work, otherwise I can't meet my commitments.
But if I'm an investor sitting in London somewhere looking at my prospects, and I see wildcat strikes, not just in the platinum sector, but now also spreading to gold, what am I to make of this?
Well, I would take a more sober view, and the sober view is that there are going to be serious risks in the short term, but certainly not in the long term. Now, I think if you really want to look at the risks, don't look at the hype now. In the longer term, the risks are in fact about supply chains, they are about warehousing, they are about logistics, they're about management. They're much less so. I would say there's a second category of risks I would look at, policy and regulatory changes. But those aren't massively on the cards that they're going to overhaul the policy terrain so completely that it leaves an investor dumbfounded and confounded. I think the ministers have sent clear signals, unequivocal signals about what the stability of the policy regime is going to be. I think this is a short-term hurdle which we're going to have to come across. But here's the third and final risk, the third sector of risk that I would look at. It cannot be business as usual. Maximizing shareholder value is not the only game in town. We're going to have to balance maximizing shareholder value with sustainability.
But what is expected of business? We had a policy conference of the ruling African National Congress in South Africa, mixed signals coming out, very opaque, difficult to read. Of course, the usual things were said, no wholesale nationalization, mixed economy, a commitment to the role of the private sector. How does business access that debate, and not just access it, but make representations on how it sees the sector transforming?
Well, I think, to be frank, business has just decided under the Thabo Mbeki regime in the early years that things were so predictable that they're going to take a step back from politics. Then came the Polokwane moment in which there was a possible turnover of power in the governing party, and then they suddenly woke up and started calling all sorts of people in to get appraised on what the situation is. I think it's time for business to get back to the debate. It's very easy to access the debate. Of course, you've also got senior ANC figures who are sitting on boards, some of them with majority shareholdings in some of these companies. So it's in fact very easy to access many of the decision makers and the policy thinking within the ANC. So I don't think business should think that it's on the back foot. I think it can constructively engage. That's the first point to make. The second is that if a business is thinking about what they ought to make about the policy changes, or at least what you're suggesting are opaque mixed signals coming from the ANC, I think the signals are quite clear. quite contrary to what you're suggesting. And they're quite clear because the nature of the ANC is that it has to fudge these issues in a general way so that it accommodates the multiple constituencies that it has to deal with. Business being one of them, which is why we're in the intractable situation that we are. So that's the second reason, and that's the second reason why it is also quite accessible for business to be part of these discussions. The third is that business is going to have to start giving up something. And this includes senior ANC leaders who are sitting on these boards or with majority shareholdings. As I was saying earlier, it cannot be business as usual. And you have to find the balance between sustainability and profitability. No one is saying that we can't have profitable mines or we shouldn't have profitable business. Of course we must, otherwise business wouldn't exist.
If one takes the fact into consideration that the ruling party is going to an elective conference in December, there's a push certainly by people attached to Julius Malema who've remained in the ruling party, who's committed to ousting the president and engineering change. What are your projections in terms of whether there will actually be a challenge to Mr. Zuma, and if so, what are his chances of in fact retaining the leadership of the ruling party? And if he doesn't, are we likely to see a turnaround on policy, particularly as it affects mining?
Look, I think it's difficult to say and conjecture that, you know, this guy is not going to be challenged. Of course he's going to be challenged. I mean, in fact, he's been challenged from day one. There was a coalition which brought him to power within the African National Congress. Very soon after he came into power, that coalition is fractured. And even though that coalition had fractured, policy predictability remained on the table. There were no wholesale policy changes, even though there were massive challenges to him. The unions are certainly not en bloc with Mr. Zuma. So there's obviously going to be a challenge. I think there is a middle ground emerging, and that middle ground is beginning to ask a question within the ANC. Can we afford the instability that we experienced between 2006 and 2007 at the time at which Mr. Zuma was elected? And I think that our answer is a resounding no, we cannot afford it. If there is going to be leadership alternation, to answer the second part of your question, is yes, there will be leadership alternation if there is going to be one, if ANC members decides that's the case. Will policy change? Well, policy will change for those people who in the current ANC are asking for nationalization simply because they want a bailout. So you're not going to have mines which are profitable, mines which are not owned by senior ANC people being affected by this. At least not to the same extent that those who are owned by ANC people. So this thing about nationalization, where Julius Malema is being used as a proxy for other voices, either for nationalization or for leadership alternation, are simply going to get what they want and then retreat. So it's not going to affect those people who are not part of this political debate.
Okay, Ebrahim, so much still to talk about, but we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time.